Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Steve Johnson, I'm a professor of counseling and just happen to be the current president of the Albert Ellis Institute. And I want to welcome all of you to this workshop on what I think is probably one of the most interesting and challenging issues that I've talked about in a long time, and maybe one of the more important, at least I've experienced it as really important as I've interacted with friends and colleagues and others. And that is, how can we lower stress by improving relationships that we have with other people and use REBT to help do that? I want to apologize to everyone who was waiting on Facebook Live for this workshop. There was just a kerfuffle in linking between the Zoom and Facebook Live. So I just thought I'd record this and make it available to everyone so that you can watch it at your leisure. You know, we humans are very social beings, and as a result, we often have this really deep desire to have relationships with other people. And when we don't experience those, we often do experience significant stress. So no relationships or poor relationships may result in stress. And over time, that stress can contribute to mental and emotional and even physical problems. You know, that's not surprising from a biochemical standpoint, that poor relationships or no relationships contribute to stress, because when we're stressed, the sympathetic nervous system is activating. That results in part to the production of cortisol, which we often call the stress hormone. And while cortisol in the short run can be actually quite adaptive, quite helpful to prepare us to, kind of respond effectively to a stressful event, over the long haul and repeatedly, it can really have some negative consequences, such as raise our blood pressure and contribute to cardiovascular problems, including heart attack and stroke, as well as suppressing the immune system, which could predispose us to experience any number of kinds of infections and other issues. So it can be quite negative over the long haul. Although this is quite interesting. When we are connected with other people, and I'll cast that net a little wider in a few minutes, but when we're connected with others, our body produces oxytocin. And research has shown repeatedly that when we have oxytocin increases within our body, that stops the action of cortisol, or it acts to minimize any of those long-term negative effects due to cortisol. There's some research about even snorting oxytocin or using a nasal spray with oxytocin, and immediately an individual gets a sense of life is better without stress within it. And so this is tremendously important. So these satisfying relationships, these satisfying connections, not only contribute to mental and emotional benefits, but physical benefits and across the boards. In fact, there have been studies on particular communities where people are highly interconnected, and even when their diets are not optimal, they still have experienced greater longevity and better health. So really good benefits to having satisfying relationships. So it's really important, I think, for us to delve into that. So as I was thinking about this topic, several questions came up I thought that might be worth looking into. What can we do to improve our relationships so that they are more satisfying and engaging? What are the impediments that we experience to making such connections? And what are our individual contributions to the poor connections, rather than saying that the situations in life or our environment are responsible or other people are responsible. What is our contribution to poor relationships? And how can we address the challenges in relationships effectively? Because there's always going to be some challenges in relationships. And then in what ways, if any ways, can REBT be a help in that process? And I want to begin with a series of points about what factors tend to have a negative impact on satisfying relationships. And I would like to begin with cognitive factors, which is not surprising for someone from an REBT perspective. And I want to look at unhelpful inferences and beliefs that we often embrace or set the stage, and in the case of the inferences, to have a negative impact on relationships. And remember, if it's been a while since you've studied REBT or you haven't encountered REBT, we make a distinction between inferences and beliefs. Inferences are those kinds of thoughts or cognitions that attribute meaning to something or interpret situations, whereas beliefs don't attribute meaning or they don't function as an interpretation of a situation or event, but they assess, then evaluate the event. So let me cover some typical inferences and beliefs, and I'll begin with an inference and often look at the associated beliefs. One is this other person deliberately ignores me. So that's an inference. That's attributing meaning to something that person did or didn't do. And then one of our responses is to believe, this is an evaluation or a belief, this is awful, this is terrible that they do that. Or they're not really a friend for doing that. So we put them down, self-down, global negative self-rating. Another inference would be this other person just constantly misunderstands me. So it must be that they just don't care. So that's an inference. That's the meaning that we're giving to some kind of situation. And that may be associated with demandingness, that the other person must care about me in the way that I want to be cared for. Maybe we're awfulizing because if they don't, that's terrible, or we can't stand it. So that would be frustration, intolerance. And then we might put the self down on the other person. Now we might go, oh, it means that I'm a loser, or no, I'm fine, but they're just a lousy friend. So we're doing a global negative rating of them. Another inference would be they just don't reciprocate my attempts to connect. So they just aren't interested in having a relationship with me. Again, that's an interpretation of a situation. And then there are associated negative beliefs associated with that. That's horrible, or what kind of a person would do that? They're just no good, they're lousy. So we see often with these kind of a global negative rating of the other person, but don't forget we could globally rate ourselves as a result of that, thinking, well, I'm just lousy at relationships. I can't do this. I'm not a friend. I'm not friendship material. Another thought that might be there is when I try to talk to this other person, they spend all their time just talking about themselves. So again, they just don't care about me. So you can imagine the beliefs that we have about the other person when they do that kind of thing. Or the last belief that I want to look at, and I'm sure you will think of all kinds of inferences and beliefs as you think about interacting with other people. One is, I need that other person. I really need them, and they're not supporting me in my time of need. So some beliefs there is a demand that they must support me in what I attribute to be a need, and I'm devaluing that other person. I'm kind of globally negative rating them, and I may experience any number of emotions such as anger or depression or anxiety or even jealousy if we sense that they're giving that attention to someone else rather than us. And then there may be behaviors associated with that. If you think you really need that person, not want them, but that you actually need them, then you may be too clingy, you may contact them too much. And doing that actually can be quite annoying to another person. And they may say, I don't want to be in a relationship with you. You're just too much of a burden. You're too much of a burden on me, and I just don't want that in a relationship. So doing that kind of inference and those associated beliefs can be very disruptive and kind of sabotage our relationships. I'm going to go into more on sabotaging inferences or inferences that sabotage relationships later. But I do want to say that a relationship or being in relationship, so in general or specific, are often perceived by someone as a threat. When they're in relationship, they begin to experience that this is a threat, or trying to enter into a relationship, they experience the presence of the other person as a threat. So let's take what kinds of threats. They may have some perceived threats. They may not be actual threats, but even if the body perceives a threat, or we interpret an interaction or the potential interaction as a threat, the body responds in particular ways. So what are the possible threats? Well, one threat is, if I try to get into this relationship, I'm just going to be rejected. Or, you know what? Everybody rejects me all the time, so I might as well just get out of the relationship now, because they're going to reject me, and so I'm going to beat them to the punch. Or the inference that I'm going to be ignored, or that I am being ignored, that sort of interpretation. Or I'm being emotionally abused in this relationship, okay? Now, a person could be, but if this is a repeated occurrence across lots of attempted relationships or in relationships, we see these same kind of inferences that are being made over and over and over again. And these inferences are setting the stage for disrupting a relationship or sabotaging a relationship. Then we begin to think that maybe the inferences are not an accurate depiction of reality. Or if I infer a threat, from the other person or being in a relationship, that's going to set the stage that I experience anxiety or fear, because that's often a normal, not helpful always, but sometimes helpful, a normal response when we interpret reality or a situation or a person as a threat. We respond with anxiety or fear, contingent on having particular kinds of beliefs about that. And also, if we infer a threat, one thing we know about the action potential when we infer a threat is we avoid. We avoid something that we have interpreted to be a threat. And so if we avoid, part of that avoidance will be avoiding the relationship. So you can see, by inferring something as this overwhelming threat and see no opportunity at all, that will set the stage for us to sabotage that relationship. So what can we do? And what can we do specifically about the inferences? I'll look at beliefs later, but what can we do when we're making those inferences and we're interpreting situations as threats repeatedly over and over again in multiple relationships? Well, one, I think it is to begin to test the reality of the presence of the threat. We need to see and really accurately find out whether this is an actual threat, or is it a perceived threat, or am I just projecting this because it's not even real yet? With anxiety, sometimes it's something that might happen in the future. So we're projecting the threat into the future, or it's some combination of all of those. So it is important for us to try to test the reality of that threat and try not to do it through the lens of your emotional response, okay? Because the emotion will tend to get in the way from assessing the reality of the threat. Another one is my threat an exaggeration? Maybe there is a threat in the relationship, that they may abandon you or misunderstand you or any number of things. But am I exaggerating that threat to a much greater likelihood than is warranted? Okay. Have I let my imagination project an unrealistic or some kind of improbable level of threat? So beginning to assess that. And sometimes you can consult with someone else or a counselor about that stuff. The other one is, what is my contribution to the threat? When I reject others, when I sense there is a challenging aspect to the others, do I do that? Do I reject others when I sense there is a challenging aspect to the relationship? Do I cling out of fear of being rejected? So you see, the inference may be associated to really clingy behavior, as I said, which may drive people away. Do I sulk and do I pout when the relationship isn't going my way? So really kind of a passive aggressive way to express the self. Many people, again, get a little burned out when someone is pouting and sulking a good amount of the time. Or, excuse me, do we assume that a relationship will always end in rejection? So that is a negative projection. Do I frequently seek assurance that everything in the relationship is going well? Again, because I perceive this as a potential threat, I want reassurance. When someone is anxious, often they want reassurance about reality. They want certainty, and they can't get it. So they frequently will continue to seek reassurance by asking, is everything okay in the relationship? Do I demand that the other person acts the way that I want them to act, care in the way that I want them to care? Okay? And do I declare that they actually must fulfill my needs? They're the only one who can fulfill my needs, okay? And then the other thing is, do you confuse your wants and your needs? Do I say things like, well, I really need for you to listen to me right now? Well, often when we say such things, it's not really a need, it's a want. And it might be, a want, we're going, yeah, it would be nice. But once we declare something to be a need, then we are rather demanding about that. Or at least we tend to disturb ourselves if we don't get that. And here's one that I see that goes on that a lot of people don't talk about. Do I contribute to making the relationship end up being about talking about the relationship incessantly? So the relationship is really all about talking about the relationship. So you're not really having a relationship. You're really spending all your time talking about the relationship because you think you have to know that it's going well and that you won't be rejected. Associated with all the ways in which we may contribute to inadequate relationships are these unhelpful inferences and beliefs. And so we really want to look at those inferences and help clients see other interpretations of the situations and the things that go in relationships, because especially if they're constantly going to the interpretation of a threat. And then beliefs, because those inferences set the stage. And then we really need to look at the level of the beliefs, because the beliefs are really going to be the proximate cause of the dysfunctional emotions and the dysfunctional behaviors in the relationship. So, so one of the ways, and I don't have a lot of time to look at dealing with the beliefs in an exhaustive way. So if you haven't had much exposure to that, I would just highly recommend that you consider taking maybe a workshop through the Albert Ellis Institute that gives kind of a basic orientation to the REBT model. And sometimes they just have a 1 day or 3 hour kind of intensive investigation of the basics of REBT, which is well worth looking into. Another issue is that we could explore is to help others with the inadequate thoughts that they have about relationships. What attitudes do we take, or do our clients take, about our own inferences and beliefs that we have like a priori to the relationship or relationships in general? So I may have beliefs about relationships in general or this specific relationship, but especially relationships in general that may really get in the way of forming or keeping quality relationships. And so one of the things, especially if they tend to be very pessimistic, if we're very pessimistic or negative or reactive, emotionally reactive to relationships, that's going to be pretty sabotaging. So what attitude could we take rather than a pessimistic or reactive kind of attitude? Well, one is to take an attitude of curiosity about the relationship. Curiosity about the inevitable negative events and situations and interactions in a relationship. So for example, let's take a situation in which I'm going out on a date with somebody. I'm hoping that it's going to be a fun evening with them, and they stand me up. I get there and they never show up. Well, instead of just jumping to the worst inference and have all kinds of beliefs, so you get really angry or depressed about this, be curious about what might have happened. And in that process, just take a stance of curiosity about what might have happened, and a curiosity about any unhelpful inferences that you make about it, or any unhelpful beliefs that you may have about it that are causing your emotional and behavioral response. So instead of just going on that inferential ride or that belief ride or that emotional ride or that behavioral ride, all of which may be dysfunctional, why don't we get real curious about what's going on inside ourselves? And instead of just going on that and assuming that what we are inferring and what we are believing is accurate. Be curious about your emotional reaction to the negative event in the relationship. Analyze it in terms of the beliefs that you're holding, and then use some of those REBT techniques that you may have learned, or if not, you could learn by taking a workshop or something. Identify those unhelpful beliefs, dispute them, and then adopt a better, more adaptive set of beliefs. Excuse me. Other things that may help form better relationships or improve the relationships we have, and help if the relationship ends, right? One is to really begin to have a sense of gratitude about relationships, and even if the relationship ends. And I have found the huge body of work that Emmons has done on the issue of gratitude is tremendously, tremendously helpful. And so we could begin to be proactive in being grateful for the other person and some of what we've received from them, and to our investment in that relationship with them in good times. So I can be grateful for that rather than just assuming that ought to be the case because this is a friendship. Be grateful even when we terminate the relationship, with the termination of a relationship, about all that you got out of that relationship. It's really interesting. I got a letter that I had received yesterday, and it came from a friend of mine who's a Jesuit priest. Jesuits are an order of the Roman Catholic Church. He's a priest. And at the very beginning of the letter, he's talking about gratefulness, which I thought was really interesting. He's talking about gratefulness in these really challenging times of COVID. And he said, really, let's be grateful about the past. Let's be aware of the current challenges and have a realistic hopefulness about the potential future. Be grateful for things like we got through the day, or I got through this challenging time in this relationship. So find occasions to be grateful for things. Like if you have a really lousy day, I kind of like that. Just at the end of the day, go, thank God, I'm grateful that this day is over and tomorrow is a new day. Another thing that we can do is shift from focusing on how you're being perceived by the other person in the relationship, and enjoy what's going on in the relationship now, or enjoy those aspects that you like that's going on in the relationship now. So shift away from how you're being perceived to being in the relationship. Actually, we've learned this in another setting. In in sex therapy, when an individual is, focusing on their performance in sex rather than, just engaging in the sex and enjoying that and enjoying being in the presence of that other person and their response, we begin to focus on our performance, and that kind of kills the performance, and it certainly kills the enjoyment and the experience of closeness in that, in the sexual engagement. So similar kind of thing. Be in a relationship rather than constantly looking at how you're perceived in the relationship. And another one that I find really helpful is, and this is related to demandingness sometimes, is for us to adopt an attitude of flexibility about our circle of friends and try to refrain from demanding that family and old friends must be our current active friends. I mean, think about some wonderful TV shows like Seinfeld and Friends. And these are selected friendships and selected significant relationships without demanding that those that we wanted to be in those relationships have to be in those relationships. Selected relationships can be that happen. You can invest in those and they can be significantly satisfying and engaging. Okay. And I had a friend that reminded me, and don't always make it about a person. You can be in relationship with pets, for example. And we're reminded of this, I was reminded of this years ago with the Hurricane Katrina. And people were really distraught that when they were worried about how their pets were. They got separated from their pets. So clearly they had formed significant connections and friendships with them, or even now in the United States with the fires in California that are raging, people are really worried about their pets. And so that's a really significant relationship that someone could invest in. And then my wife actually reminded me of one yesterday, and that is that some of the interesting and surprising instances of forming satisfying relationships out of necessity. And so she reminded me of the Tom Hanks movie Castaway. And I was a little, kerfuffled when she said that, confused. And she said, "Steve, do you remember Tom Hanks? He's isolated on this island, and he formed a significant relationship with his volleyball. And he named it Wilson." And I'm like, wow, I never thought of forming relationships with other objects. But then when I got to thinking about it, yeah, we do it all the time, I formed a strange relationship with my coffee cup, my favorite coffee cup that I constantly use in the morning. I know exactly how much it will hold and the whole thing. And so if my coffee cup is gone, I miss it, and I go searching for its presence because I have a significant relationship with that. And also the environment, when I'm connected with parts of the environment, so that when I hear about some environmental catastrophe, then that touches my values, and I do feel the loss there. And so I think what I'm trying to say is, yeah, let's invest in people, but there are pets and other things. Throw that relationship web, that net really, really wide, and see what happens of that. One of the things that I learned as a result of 9/11, and we celebrated that yesterday here, and was because every day I would take the subway that would always stop at the World Trade Center. And I would get off, and I had an activity that I did on up Church Street, just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. And so I remembered with the catastrophe there, I remembered the shopkeepers, the shops and the shopkeepers, that I would always stop and, if I get a smoothie, that I would have a nice conversation, ask them how their kids are doing. and about events in their life, their vacation, and all of these kinds of things. So those are significant relationships. And so I think if we punctuate those, that we take time to have gratitude for even those relationships, we have these little bursts of oxytocin that really contribute to well-being in life, and that we can be grateful for those. I posted on Facebook yesterday that in 9/11, my younger daughter was really quite young, and she loved animals then. She still absolutely loves animals. And we came home, and I know we were all feeling disconnected and distraught. And Shannon was looked really anxious. And I asked her about it, and she said, "Daddy, were the birds killed? Did those planes hit the birds, and did they get killed?" And so this was a real concern to her. So I took her outside, and we looked up into the sky for a few minutes, and she saw some birds, and that brought great joy to her. And I really learned from that the connection that we do make with things in nature that are really, really important for us. And so one last example is my father died a number of years ago from cancer. And every Sunday, I learned that he would always go to his favorite gas station. He would, pump gas in his car. He would buy the newspaper and interacted with the lady that worked there. And when he died, my mother took her car to that gas station, and she told the lady there that my father had died, because she knew that they would wonder about him. And the lady goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry, because I loved seeing him every Sunday, because he would always come in," she said, "buy the gas, buy the paper, but he would always take some time to tell me a joke and ask me how my life was going." And again, significant connection there that really makes a difference. So enough on that one. There is some wonderful work on loneliness that was done by Dr. John Capiopa that investigates the causes of loneliness, or the results of loneliness and disconnectedness and not satisfying connections. And he developed a 4-step approach, or 4 steps for overcoming loneliness and or disconnection from others that I think are highly relevant to this discussion. And he called his process EASE, E-A-S-E, and each letter, of course, stands for something. The first E stands for extend yourself. In other words, take a risk by perceiving others as opportunity rather than just a threat. Or a mix of threat and opportunity, and then act out of the potential opportunity that a relationship might have. Anybody who's ever dated knows that sometimes asking somebody out on a date can be a threat or perceived threat. But if we focus on the opportunity of it, then and act into the opportunity, then sometimes it goes well. Sometimes you get shot down and rejected, but if you go, okay, this is an odds game, and so you keep at it, So extend yourself, connect with others in really small ways, as we've already talked about, by short phrases that you say, "What a beautiful day," or "Have a wonderful day." I moved from up north down to the south, and it's amazing how often everybody wishes each other to have they usually say, "Have a wonderful day," or "Have a blessed day." And it's nice to hear that from strangers. The A stands for active plan. Based and create a plan for interacting with other people, right? Connecting with other people. Make it realistic and doable. In other words, kind of brainstorm about potential obstacles too that might get in the way of connecting with other people. Be realistic, and then take some steps as they show up. You've already thought about some of those. The other thing here is, with an action plan, make sure that you allow the plan to be a preference, an important preference of yours, rather than a demand about the outcome. Because if you demand the outcome and it doesn't come out that way, you're going to set the stage for you. If you have a bump in that action plan, that you're going to make that an occasion of causing major distress. Whereas if you hold it loosely, but importantly, see it as a preference, then you kind of inoculate yourself from that. The S stands for selection. And here it is, focus on the quality of the relationships that you have, rather than thinking you need a huge quantity of relationships. Now, I know we're living in the age of Facebook, and Facebook kind of sets us up in many ways, not completely, but sets us up to focus on how many connections we have. So people will say, I've got 3,000 friends. Really? 3,000 friends. How deep is the connection? What do you know about the inner life of that other individual? How much investment are you making other than post, right? So not to minimize post and sharing on post. That can be important. But that focus on quantity over quality can, if the quantity is not what you demand, be used to upset yourself, okay? So I think but let me point out that I find Facebook to be very helpful for those, can be very helpful for individuals who are advanced in age, who have some medical conditions, a health condition that makes it very difficult for them to get out of the house and connect with others. I know people that find that to be a very satisfying and enjoyable relationship, and they begin to have at least move that over to having Zoom interviews, or not interviews, but Zoom conversations and meetings with people. So it can be a stage if you use the opportunity, okay? So invest and take a risk in what seems like it has the potential to be a qualitatively good relationship. And then the last E is expect, not demand. Be proactive about forming relationships and not just reactive and wait around for someone to try to connect with you. Connect and watch your thinking going, wait a minute, why am I doing all the connecting and nobody else seems to be doing the connecting? Well, because you're interested in relationships, so try the connection, okay? And actually, loneliness and poor relationships are often caused by demanding absolute safety in a relationship. Now, we want physical safety, of course, so let's be realistic there. But to demand that everything is safe, has to be safe in terms of, and we interpret safety as they don't say anything negative to us or about us, that can be really getting in the way. Or that we demand acceptance, or we demand reciprocity to the degree that we want, that's going to get in the way. Loneliness and poor relationships may be partially caused by that pessimistic perspective that we talked about, because that pessimistic perspective can get manifested in a critical attitude that focuses on real or perceived negative aspects of the relationship. Now, once you have developed that perspective and that critical perspective, then confirmation bias kicks in. Confirmation bias then would have you register those negative events in a relationship and ignore any positive event. So that's what we call a confirmation bias. We have a belief, and then we sift through the environment, focusing only on those forms of data that substantiate or validate our belief, and we ignore everything else. Okay? So the other thing is that loneliness and poor relationships can be partially caused by being passive and withdrawing from life. Now, that often is the case if we're depressed about something. You know, and when we're depressed, there's a tendency to withdraw from life, and part of withdrawing from life is withdrawing from significant and important relationships. And because once we do that, we fail to take what might be productive risk to reach out to others. Now, I think it's important when we get serious about reaching out to people and trying to form relationships or deepening relationships that we do have is that we have some goals. Now, don't become, overly focused on goals, but having some goals would be really helpful. So form relationship goals that I would say are more approach goals than avoidance goals. Avoidance goals would be we're trying to avoid something, such as I want to avoid getting rejected by somebody, or I want to avoid people perceiving me in any kind of negative way, or I want to avoid people who don't put me as the absolute top priority in their life. Those avoidance goals are very complicated because you have to think of all the possible ways to avoid something. Better is to take an approach goal. Approach goal is trying to attain something rather than avoid something. Examples in this relationship domain. I want to reach out to 5 people this week that I haven't talked to in a while. Make a phone call or whatever, okay? That is an approach goal, it's concrete, and all I have to do is find one way to make those calls. Another approach goal would be, I'm gonna join a meetup group and group of people who share one of the values that's really important to me. Maybe it is hiking, I really, really like, and so I'm gonna try to connect with people who hike. Or in one state, I was in a group with some guys, and we called ourselves the Fat Guys for Lunch Bunch, and we had our goal every year was to focus on one food that we were going to try to hit all the restaurants that we could that had reputations for that good food. Like one year it was pizza, I think another year it was the perfect cheeseburger or something like that. So it's a connection. And was really, really significant. We've stayed in contact with each other, supported each other when we've been ill. Several of us have had cancer, and we've gotten each other through those events. And it's really helped to form significant relationships there. So approach goals rather than avoidance goals can be really helpful. The other one is to be open and curious about what looks like others rejecting you or ignoring you. Okay, I've said this a little bit, but I want us to really take some time to, when we're seeing something in that way, take a little bit of time and brainstorm about possible reasons why it looks that way. Maybe that other person is afraid of getting rejected as much as you are. Maybe they're experiencing getting close with somebody and deepening the relationship is a threat. That as the closer they get and the deeper the relationship goes, the potential to be hurt seems to go up for them. And so that may be part of what's getting in the way of the deepening of a relationship that you really are invested in. What if they've gone through a recent rejection in a relationship? And so that's kind of raw for them. And so they're kind of engaging in confirmation bias. They're seeing everything through that lens, right? Or at least relationships through that lens right there. Maybe they're focused on potential threat rather than the potential opportunity in a relationship. And remember, there can be threat in a relationship, but if we can also see the great opportunity and act into that opportunity, then that may help. But some people only see it as a threat, and they're not even aware, they're not even brainstorming about the potential opportunity. So that can get in the way of a relationship. So what do we do in those situations? Well, one is to, we learned as therapists, is to focus on process and try to bring the process up to the level of awareness. So I find that really helpful in friendships. So when we're sensing that we're being rejected, or when we're sensing any number of things that's kind of negative in a relationship, one of the things you can do is bring it out in the open. Now, don't spend time doing that all the time, right? Because then you're focusing on analyzing the relationship rather than the relationship. But occasionally bring that out into the open and just kind of state your openness to brainstorm together about this, what may be going on. And that is contributing to a supportive relationship that may be more mutually beneficial and enjoyable, with the awareness that at times there will be challenges. So I hope that you got something out of this that maybe you could use personally, or even with your clients, that it benefited you in some way. And so all the best as you seek relationships that you would like to experience as enjoyable and fulfilling. And thank you so much. And I hope you take a look at upcoming workshops here on YouTube and Facebook, and also maybe the personal and professional workshops that are offered through the Albert Ellis Institute. Thank you and have a wonderful, wonderful day.